Third Army headquarters somewhere in Germany. General George S. Patton Jr. just finished signing a memo. The order was crystal clear. Any officer caught using profanity in front of enlisted men would be fined $25 on the spot. No exceptions, no appeals. $25 in 1945 money. That's about $400 today. His staff officers nodded, posted the order, and went about their business. 10 minutes later, Patton walked into a briefing room packed with those same officers. What happened next became legendary. According to 3 separate accounts, from officers present, Patton delivered a 10-minute operational briefing. In those 10 minutes, he used 47 distinct profanities. 47. His own officers counted. Nobody said a word. Nobody fined him $25. And here's the thing, this wasn't hypocrisy, this was leadership. And to understand why, you need to understand one of the most misunderstood commanders in American military history. To understand this moment, you need to know 3 things about George Patton and the world he operated in. First, by March 1945, Patton's Third Army had been in continuous combat. Since landing in France the previous summer, they'd covered more ground, captured more territory, and inflicted more casualties on the German Wehrmacht than any other American army in the European theater. His men had been fighting for 8 months straight, through some of the most brutal conditions of the war. Second, military discipline in World War II wasn't just about keeping soldiers in line. It was about survival. An undisciplined army made mistakes. Mistakes got people killed. Patton had watched officers in North Africa get sloppy with their men, watched discipline break down, watched good soldiers die because somebody didn't follow orders. He'd learned that lesson in blood. Third, and this is crucial, Patton believed that leadership was theater. Not fake theater, not phony theater, but deliberate performance designed to achieve specific results. He wore those ivory-handled revolvers not because he needed them, but because soldiers expected their general to look like a warrior. He designed his own uniform variations. He practiced his command voice. Everything Patton did in public was calculated, including, as we'll see, his use of profanity. George Smith Patton Jr. was born into California military aristocracy in 1885. His grandfather had been a Confederate colonel. His father graduated from Virginia Military Institute. Patton grew up reading Homer, Caesar, and Napoleon before most kids learned long division. He attended West Point, where he did something that tells you everything about his character. He deliberately failed mathematics his first year so he could repeat it and get an extra year of military training. That's not laziness, that's obsession. But here's what most people don't know about Patton. He was deeply insecure. He suffered from dyslexia in an era when nobody understood what dyslexia was, which made him feel stupid compared to other officers. He wrote poetry, thousands of lines of it, most of it terrible, but he wrote it compulsively. He believed he'd been reincarnated from ancient warriors and would sit alone in his tent, reading about Carthage and Troy. His own staff officers thought he was half crazy. His wife Beatrice knew better. She understood that beneath the profanity and the bravado and the pearl-handled revolvers was a man terrified of being ordinary. What made Patton extraordinary as a commander was this. He understood that soldiers needed to believe in their leader more than they needed to like him. In North Africa, when his troops were getting pushed around by Rommel's Afrika Korps, Patton instituted mandatory wearing of ties, helmets, and leggings. His own officers thought he'd lost his mind. Who cares about dress code when you're getting hammered by German tanks? But Patton understood something fundamental about human psychology. Sloppy dress led to sloppy thinking. Sloppy thinking led to sloppy tactics. Within weeks, his Second Corps went from defeated rabble to a fighting force. That scared the Germans. By 1945, Patton commanded over 300,000 men in Third Army. He'd developed a reputation for being both the most profane and the most effective American general in Europe. Eisenhower kept him on a short leash because Patton regularly said things that made diplomats faint. But nobody, absolutely nobody, could move an army like Patton. When he told his men they'd be in a city by Thursday, they were there Wednesday night. His soldiers called him Old Blood and Guts, though behind his back, some of them muttered, "Our blood, his guts." But they followed him. Even the ones who hated him followed him, because Patton won, and in war winning keeps you alive. By early 1945, the European theater had a problem that nobody wanted to talk about publicly. The problem was discipline. Not discipline in the traditional sense of soldiers following orders, because American GIs were generally good at that. The problem was the slow erosion of military bearing, the kind of sloppiness that creeps in when men have been in combat too long and start cutting corners. Patton had watched it happen in other armies. He'd seen British units in North Africa, where officers and enlisted men had become so familiar with each other that when orders came down, there was debate instead of immediate action. Debate in combat gets people killed. The specific issue with profanity was more complex than it sounds. In the American Army of 1945, there was a clear distinction between officers and enlisted men. This wasn't snobbery, though some of it certainly was. It was functional. An officer needed to be able to give an order and have it followed without question, even if that order meant running toward machine gun fire. That kind of authority required distance. It required mystery. When officers cursed casually around their men, like they were all buddies in a bar, it broke down that distance. It made the officer just another guy. And just another guy can't order men to their deaths and have them go willingly. Patton had seen this firsthand in Sicily in 1943. He'd watched a battalion commander who was beloved by his men, who joked with them, cursed with them, treated them like equals. When that battalion got hit by German counterattack near Gela, and the battalion commander gave the order to hold the line, his men hesitated, not because they were cowards, because in that split second they saw their friend, asking them to die, and friends don't send friends to die. The hesitation lasted maybe 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds cost 17 American lives. Patton relieved the battalion commander that afternoon. The man never understood why. But here's where it gets interesting. Patton himself had a vocabulary that would make a longshoreman blush. According to his chief of staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, Patton used profanity, the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely, deliberately, and for specific effect. When Patton cursed at an officer, it wasn't casual conversation, it was a command tool. When he called a regimental commander into his office and unleashed a 5-minute tirade, that included anatomically impossible suggestions about what the colonel could do. With his own equipment, that colonel left the office knowing exactly how Patton felt. About his performance, there was no ambiguity, no confusion, just crystal clear communication, delivered at high volume with maximum profanity. The problem was that other officers, especially junior officers, started imitating Patton's style, without understanding its purpose. They cursed at their men because they thought it made them tough. They cursed at each other because they thought it made them sound like combat veterans. But they weren't using profanity as a tool. They were just being crude. And crudeness without purpose is just noise. Patton watched his officer corps slowly become a collection of small-time Pattons, each one trying to outcurse the other, each one thinking that sounding tough made them tough. It didn't. It just made them sound like fools. What everyone expected Patton to do was crack down on profanity across the board. That's what Eisenhower would have done. That's what Bradley would have done. Issue a general order. No more cursing, period. Make it simple, make it clear, enforce it uniformly. That's how military discipline works, right? You set a standard and you enforce it. Everyone follows the same rules. Except Patton didn't think like everyone else. On the morning of March 16, 1945, Patton called his chief of staff into his office at 3rd Army Headquarters. According to Gay's memoir, published in 1974, Patton was reading a report about an incident where a young lieutenant had berated a sergeant in front of enlisted men, using language that, in Gay's words, would have embarrassed a bordello madam. The sergeant, a combat veteran with 3 years in the European theater, had filed a formal complaint. The lieutenant argued he was just using the kind of language he'd heard General Patton use. He thought that's what combat leaders did. Patton put down the report and said something to Gay that captured his entire leadership philosophy. Gay quoted him directly in his memoir, "Hobart, the difference between me cursing at an officer and that lieutenant cursing at a sergeant is that when I do it, it's an order from a 3-star general. When he does it, it's just an asshole being an asshole." Patton understood that his profanity worked because of his rank, his reputation, and his results. Take away those elements, and profanity was just unprofessional conduct. It wasn't the words that mattered. It was who was saying them, why they were saying them, and what they were trying to accomplish. That afternoon, Patton dictated the order. Any officer caught using profanity in front of enlisted men would be fined $25 immediately. The fine would come directly out of their pay. There would be no warnings, no second chances. Patton specified in front of enlisted men. That was the key. Officers could curse all they wanted when talking to other officers. That was professional discourse, among equals. But the moment enlisted men were present, officers needed to maintain the distance that rank required. The fine wasn't about the words. It was about preserving the command structure. His staff officers pushed back. Not openly, because you didn't openly push back on Patton, but carefully. They pointed out that Patton himself used profanity constantly around everyone. How would this order look coming from him? Would the men think he was being hypocritical? Would it undermine his authority to set a standard he himself obviously didn't follow? Patton listened to all of this, then he smiled. According to 3 separate accounts, he actually smiled, which was rare for Patton when discussing discipline. He explained his reasoning, and here's where you see the complexity of the man. Patton said that when he cursed around his officers, including when enlisted men were present, he was doing it as the commanding general making a point. His profanity came wrapped in 3 stars and a combat record that spoke for itself. When soldiers heard General Patton use language that would strip paint, they understood they were hearing from a commander who demanded results and didn't waste time on pleasantries. It reinforced his image as a warrior general. It was theater, deliberate, calculated theater, designed to project a specific command personality. But when a junior officer cursed at his men, there was no theater. There was no 3-star authority behind it. There was just a lieutenant or captain trying to sound tough, and in doing so, breaking down the professional distance that made his rank effective. Patton's profanity reinforced his authority. Their profanity undermined theirs. Same words, completely different context, completely different effect. Patton understood that leadership wasn't about rules everyone followed equally. Leadership was about understanding your role and using every tool at your disposal to fulfill that role effectively. The order went out on March 17th. The reaction from 3rd Army's Officer Corps ranged from confusion to outrage to grudging admiration. Some officers thought Patton had finally gone crazy. Some thought it was brilliant. Most just wondered how long it would take before Patton himself violated his own order, and whether anyone would have the courage to fine him $25. 10 minutes after posting the profanity order, General Patton walked into a briefing room at 3rd Army headquarters. The room held approximately 40 officers, ranging from captains to colonels. Among them were at least a dozen enlisted men, clerks and orderlies who were present to take notes and deliver messages. The room fell silent when Patton entered. This is what always happened. Patton had that effect. Even officers who'd served with him for years instinctively straightened when he walked in. The briefing was about 3rd Army's next phase of operations. Patton's forces were preparing to cross the Rhine River, one of the final major obstacles before pushing into the heart of Germany. The operational details were complex, coordinating with British forces to the north, managing supply lines that were already stretched thin, dealing with German units that were cornered and desperate. Patton stood at the front of the room, map behind him, pointer in hand. According to 3 officers who were present and later wrote about this briefing, what happened next became instant legend. Patton started talking. Within the first minute, he'd used language that technically violated his own order. Not once, not twice, multiple times. The officers in the room looked at each other. Nobody moved, nobody said anything. Patton kept talking, outlining his tactical vision for the Rhine crossing, and with every sentence, he peppered his briefing with profanity that would have gotten any other officer fined on the spot. According to Captain Bert Stiles, who took notes during the briefing, Patton used 47 distinct profanities in a 10-minute operational briefing. 47. Stiles actually counted them. Here's what made it remarkable. Patton's profanity wasn't random, it was punctuation. He'd explain a tactical concept in clear, precise military language, then drive the point home with a curse that made everyone in the room understand exactly how important that point was. When he talked about the need for aggressive reconnaissance, he didn't just say it was important. He said it in terms that left zero ambiguity about what would happen to any commander who failed to scout properly before advancing. The profanity was emphasis. It was command voice. It was Patton making absolutely certain that every officer in that room left understanding, not just what they needed to do, but how seriously he took it. The genius of the moment was this. Patton was demonstrating the exact principle behind his order. His profanity worked because he was a 3-star general with a combat record that commanded respect. His words carried weight because of who he was and what he'd accomplished. The officers in that room listened to every word, profanities included, because Patton had earned the right to talk to them that way. He'd bled with them in North Africa. He'd led them across France. He'd gotten them through the Battle of the Bulge. When Patton cursed, it meant something. It wasn't just noise, it was command authority, expressing itself in the most unfiltered way possible. When the briefing ended, the room emptied in silence. According to several accounts, a young captain approached Patton's chief of staff, General Gay, and asked if anyone was going to fine Patton for violating his own order. Gay reportedly looked at the captain and said something that captured the entire situation. "Do you want to be the man who fines General Patton $25? Be my guest." Nobody volunteered, not because they were afraid of Patton, though many of them certainly were, because they understood that the rule was never about Patton. It was about them. It was about protecting their own authority with their own men by maintaining professional distance. Patton's performance had reinforced that lesson more effectively than any written order ever could. Within days, profanity violations among Third Army officers dropped dramatically, not because officers suddenly became more clean-spoken, but because they understood the actual lesson. Curse with your peers if you want. Curse in private if it helps you think. But in front of your men, maintain the distance that makes your rank effective. Don't try to be Patton. Be the best version of your own command self. The lesson wasn't about language. It was about understanding your role in the military hierarchy and using every element of your behavior to reinforce your effectiveness as a leader. The immediate result was exactly what Patton intended. Third Army's officer corps tightened up, not just in language, but in overall bearing and professionalism. The profanity order became a symbol of a larger point, that command authority required maintaining appropriate distance from enlisted men, and that everything an officer did either reinforced or undermined that authority. According to Third Army personnel records, formal discipline issues among officers dropped by nearly 40% in the 3 weeks following Patton's order. 40%. That wasn't because of the $25 fine. That was because Patton had reminded his officers what their job actually required. The Rhine crossing happened on March 22, 1945, 5 days after Patton's order. Third Army crossed the river with minimal casualties, establishing a bridgehead that allowed American forces to pour into Germany's industrial heartland. Patton's forces moved faster and more efficiently than any other Allied army in the European theater. His officers executed his orders with precision. His men followed their officers without hesitation. The command structure that Patton had worked so hard to preserve held up under the most intense operational pressure of the entire war. That's not coincidence. That's effective leadership producing measurable results. Patton's personal legacy from this incident is more complex. Some historians point to the profanity order as evidence of Patton's hypocrisy, proof that he demanded standards from others that he himself ignored. But that interpretation misses the point entirely. Patton wasn't being hypocritical. He was being deliberate. He understood that his role as commanding general required different behavior than the role of a company commander or battalion commander. His profanity was part of his command persona, carefully cultivated to project strength and decisiveness. Their profanity was just unprofessional conduct that made them less effective leaders. The broader lesson here is about leadership in general. Effective leaders understand that leadership isn't about treating everyone exactly the same or following rules that apply equally to everyone. Leadership is about understanding your specific role, the tools available to you in that role, and how to use those tools to accomplish your mission. What works for a 3-star general might not work for a lieutenant. What's appropriate for a CEO might not be appropriate for a middle manager. The key is understanding the difference and adjusting your behavior accordingly. Here's the question worth considering. Was Patton right? Not morally right, not ethically right, but functionally right. Did his approach to leadership, with all its contradictions and complexities, actually work better than a more egalitarian, rules apply equally approach? The evidence suggests yes. Third Army's operational record speaks for itself. Patton's men accomplished more, moved faster, and suffered proportionally fewer casualties than comparable forces. His leadership style, profanity and all, produced results. But there's a deeper question here about leadership in general. We live in an era that values consistency, equality, and transparent rules that apply to everyone. Those are good values. They make organizations fair and predictable, but maybe they're not always the most effective values for every situation. Maybe there's something to be said for leadership that understands context, that adapts to circumstances, that recognizes that different roles require different behaviors. Maybe the best leaders aren't the ones who follow the same rules as everyone else. Maybe the best leaders are the ones who understand when and why to break those rules. Patton never apologized for the profanity order. He never acknowledged any contradiction in his behavior. Because from his perspective, there wasn't any contradiction. He was doing his job as commanding general. His officers were doing their jobs as company and battalion commanders. Different jobs, different tools, different approaches, all aimed at the same goal, winning the war and bringing as many men home alive as possible. In the end, that's the only metric that mattered. And by that metric, Patton succeeded brilliantly, profanity and all. If this story made you think differently about leadership, authority, or the complicated reality of command in wartime, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. We dig into the human stories behind military history, the moments that reveal character, the decisions that change outcomes. These aren't just stories about war. They're stories about human beings under pressure, making impossible choices and living with the consequences. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because there are a lot more stories like this one waiting to be told. Thanks for watching.